Okay, in terms of the stuff, as always, just bad news. Some negative news, but not today. Deadline says been all along for exam 2, quizzes part 3, and exam 3. They deadline-fied June 17th, so 2 days from now at end of day, 11:59 p.m. Exam 4, quizzes part 4, exam 5, deadline-fied June 18th, also end of day, so 11:59 p.m. For the paper, today, June 11th, deadline for the, today, June 15th, deadline for the full credit. If you haven't turned the paper in for the +5 bonus, and you want to get the full credit, just upload it to Blackboard before end of day today, and you'll get the full credit for that. The half credit deadline is June 18th, and I'll turn the grades in on June 19th. Be sure to check your grades on Blackboard, make sure that everything is as you think it should be, and if there's a problem, be sure to contact me, in time, so something can be done about it. In terms of knowing what your overall grade is, thing to do is look at your overall grade column on Blackboard, use like a normal web browser as opposed to the mobile app, which does weird stuff. And you look at the overall grade column, and that'll give you your overall grade. And that assumes a couple things. One, it assumes anything you haven't done is treated as a 0. So if you haven't done like the final yet, or exam 3 or 4 yet, those are treated as zeros, which would be why if your overall grade is pretty low, probably 1. Also, Blackboard is set from the start to do all the keeping of good scores. And so for the scores, the best 10 quizzes out of all of them count, the best 4 exams out of 5 count, and of course the paper counts. And it starts doing that from day 1. So I don't have to go in and manually adjust it. So your overall grade reports your real-time grade in the course with those 2 things. Again, anything you haven't done, treated as 0, and it's already doing the keeping of the best scores. And so the overall grade would be what you get if you just said, yeah, I'm done with this stuff, no more stuff, and just didn't do any more stuff. So if you've done the 4 of the exams, at least 10 of the quizzes and the paper, and you're wondering, should you take the final or not, if your overall grade is satisfactory and you don't want to do the final, then you wouldn't have to, because again, the best 4 count. The final is already treated as a 0 if you haven't done it, and it keeps the best 4, so it would have been dropped out. As I mentioned before deciding not to do stuff, good idea to send an email with your name saying, this is what I think I got. Do I really have this? And sometimes, for some reason, people look, I don't know where, and they're mistaken about that. So again, before deciding not to do anything, take a few seconds to send an email, and then I'll respond back saying, yep, that's what you got, or nope, you don't get that. Before pressing on to the new stuff, anything about the stuff to be, or the stuff that has been, that requires more stuff. Okay. So last time we're looking at our good dead friend Immanuel Kant, talking about the categorical comparative, and we saw some of the problems with Kantian ethics. And now we switch gears to go from ethics, good and evil and all that stuff, to aesthetics, which is good art, bad art, and all that stuff. As we saw back in the ancient days of 6 weeks ago, back at the start of the semester, we saw that aesthetics is all about theories of art and beauty. So it's a part of philosophy that deals with all that artsy stuff. Now, there are, as I mentioned before, various sort of ways of looking at this. One thing is, of course, just like with ethics, what we can call descriptive aesthetics. And that deals with saying what particular people at a particular time, say in a particular culture or location, regard as beautiful or art, or what they like or dislike. And this is a sort of field, the sort of things that are covered by the fields of psychology, sociology, art history, etc. So for example, if you take an art history course, and they talk about the art of, say, the ancient Egyptians, and talk about its solidity and how it's created to endure for eternity, or they talk about the mathematical proportions of ancient Greek art, and talk about its mathematics and harmony and so forth. That'd be descriptive aesthetics. It's not doing philosophy stuff. It's saying this is the sort of stuff these people did, or what people like. To use another example of descriptive aesthetics, when they talk about beauty standards, going back through history, like what is it to be beautiful, that would be descriptive aesthetics. If you say, in the Renaissance, this was the image of beauty. In the 1950s, this was the image of beauty. In the 1970s, it was this. In 2015, it's that. And that'd be descriptive aesthetics. Now, if we just stuck with description, we'd be doing stuff that's perhaps interesting and important, but we wouldn't be doing philosophy stuff. So, how do we move away from description to the philosophy stuff? Well, just like with ethics, there are the different levels of abstraction. The most abstract is, just like with ethics, called the meta, or meta-aesthetics level. And this deals with the most theoretical, abstract, high-level questions. Questions like, what is beauty? Is art objective? Is beauty a property of the world? Or is subjective? Everyone's heard the expression, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And those would be fairly meta questions, very theoretical. Taking a step down is the normative level, where we develop our standards, rules, and principles, which we then apply. So, for example, at this normative level, a theory about, say, what makes particular works of art good. Like what it would be to be a good, say, a suspense film, or what it would be to be a good work in, the genre of jazz, for example. And so that'd be a normative level, working out the standards and principles. Now, the level we're probably most familiar with is a level that is at the applied level. That's where we take, hopefully, our principles, rules, and standards, and, shockingly enough, apply them to particular works. To give some concrete examples, suppose you're thinking about, going to see a movie, and you're wondering, should you, spend 10 or 20 bucks, to see Jurassic World? And what you might do is look for an example of applied aesthetics. And a good example would be to go to Rotten Tomatoes and look at the reviews. And that would be applied aesthetics. So they review it, hopefully by some sort of standards, as to what makes a good film or a bad film. And so reviewing of works, good example of applied aesthetics. Also, of course, is something we do ourselves. If you go and see the movie and you really like it and talk about, the great special effects, the quality of the acting, the coherence of the story, the brilliance of the soundtrack, raptors riding motorcycles, that type of stuff. And that would be doing applied aesthetics, be applying your standards to particular cases. So to recap, descriptive aesthetics basically deals with saying the concepts of art and beauty held by particular people at a particular time. This is what people thought was beautiful, like that. The meta is the most abstract, like, is beauty objective or subjective, that type of stuff, or what is beauty. Normative level, laying out standards, rules, and principles. Then applied is, shockingly enough, actually applying it. Now, there's all kinds of problems and questions in aesthetics, and some of these blend into other areas. Some we've already looked at. Like the most abstract one is, of course, what is art? What separates things that are not art from art? Then there's the long question of what is beauty? Is it something in the world objectively, or something subjectively in the eye of the beholder? And moving away from sort of like the way you think it was like pure aesthetics, there are also various social and political issues. For example, the area of censorship can be looked at as legal, also ethical, and also dealing with aesthetics, because it deals with the censorship of works of art. And then, of course, there's various other questions that come up. For example, one popular one is questions about forgeries. Can a forgery of a work be as valuable aesthetically as a non-forgery? Because one thing that's somewhat interesting or boring is if you have a forgery of, say, a Picasso, it may look great and wonderful, but its value comes not from its visible qualities, the quality of the work, but whether it's actually a Picasso or not. And it may seem somewhat odd if we're judging the value of a work of art that we need to know, say, who created it. That if it's a Picasso, then it's worth like $4 million. If it was just some guy who created a wonderful painting, it's worth like 10 bucks. So why is it that having that name on it would make it more valuable? I mean, we have a practical answer, because people put out stacks of cash for Picasso and not for, say, you know, Bill Jones, but interesting stuff. So there's all kinds of questions and problems in aesthetics. Now, one way to sort of put aesthetics into some kind of context is to use the analogy I used before. We can kind of think of the people who do aesthetics as like being, in a way, lawmakers. So we can make that parallel. People who do aesthetic theory are kind of like state legislatures. They make up the rules. Then, of course, you have the people that apply those standards, which may be the same people that make them up, and they're the critics. And of course, in the legal system, they're the judges. And then you've got the people that the criticisms are applied to. In the case of art, they're the artists. In the case of laws, they would be the plaintiffs, defendants, etc. And so it's a similar sort of analogy or metaphor. So now we'll turn from the introductory stuff to our first reading, and only reading, in aesthetics. If you're interested in more aesthetic stuff, well, always movies to see, songs to hear, books to read. But every spring, there's the aesthetics class, PHI 4800, offered every spring. Our first reading is by our good dead friend, Oscar Wilde. He was born in 1864, died in 1900, still dead today. Pretty famous guy, wrote a lot of stuff, did poetry and plays. Some of his best known works are The Canterville Ghost, which is actually made into a film by Disney many years ago. Probably his best known work, though, is the Portrait of Dorian Gray, which is the kind of famous story about a person who has a painting, and the painting, whatever harms the person the painting of, would suffer, like aging, etc. It's instead suffered by the picture, and not the person who the picture of. If you ever saw the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, he's one of the characters in that graphic novel. So, wrote a lot of stuff, got in trouble for sexual orientation, in prison for a while, but was pretty famous and still famous today, but quite dead. Now, the reading we got from him is an essay he wrote called The New Aesthetics, which fits in aesthetics quite nicely because it's aesthetics plus also new. It's a dialogue, and like any dialogue, of course, it's got some characters saying some stuff. The two characters are Vivian, who represents Wilde's view, because we know that because Vivian wins and stuff, and the opposing character is Cyril, who loses. And so, presumably, Vivian is presenting his viewpoint. Now, Vivian puts forth the following claim. Everyone, of course, has heard the expression that art imitates life, that art is a copy of life. And the character Vivian puts forth the reverse of that. Instead of art imitating life, it is the claim put forth that life imitates art, that life holds up a mirror to art and imitates it. Now it begins by presenting something that certainly would be relevant today when people talk about concerns about life imitating art. They usually bring up the negative stuff. And Wilde brings up the example of how people have committed suicide because artists have done so. And so what he sort of points to is something people are very concerned about today, namely the potentially harmful effects of art. And so one way to look at art, or rather life imitating art, would be that whenever a tragic shooting occurs, what people typically do, often in media, is look at what the people conducting the shooting, what sort of music they listen to, what sort of movies they watch, etc. So back in 1999, the infamous Columbine shootings, they looked at the music that the shooters listened to, looked at the video games they played, etc. And so there's that possibility. So sort of, Wilde doesn't go into much detail here, but it does kind of allude to that potential harmful influence of art. But his main claim is that not that art is imitating life, but in the reversal, that life imitates art. And so the character of Cyril lays out a challenge to the character of Vivian. The challenge is this. Vivian has to show that nature and life imitate art. He's got to make a case for this. And so what Vivian does is endeavor to do this, to show that it is not, art imitating life, but the reverse. So what he does is this. He claims that the change in London's climate is due to a school of art, and talks about how, the mists and the fading forms and so forth and the fogs are due to artists. Now, one way to interpret this is kind of the very unusual kind of way, is a literal way. That literally the painters are creating the fogs, creating, the climate in London. And I remember, centuries ago when I was a kid, there was a TV show about a kid with magic chalk. And whatever you would draw would become real. And I presume they probably, since they just keep reusing everything, I assume there's probably a show like that today. Now, even though Wilde could be, kind of taken as saying something kind of absurd like that the artists are out there, magically creating the climate, it doesn't actually mean that. So a good question would be, like, what does he mean when he says that fogs are due to the Impressionists, that the climate of London is due to a particular school of art? He says he doesn't mean that they're out there magically creating this stuff. Well, what he claims is this. He claims that nature is actually our creation, and sort of his main argument is this. He draws a distinction between looking and seeing. One somewhat more common way to look at this is when people draw a distinction between listening and hearing. And the distinction is basically this, that a person could hear something, hear someone else talking, the difference between just sort of hearing them and listening to them. I mean, to use one obvious sort of analogy or example, you could hear someone speaking a language you don't understand, but in a way you really can't listen to them because you have no idea what they're talking about. And people often complain that someone is hearing them but not listening to them. And so we can see a similar distinction between looking and seeing. Looking is just, visually impinges. You're just pointing your eyeballs in that direction, and light is bouncing off, hitting that, the optic sensors. So Wilde makes the claim that things are because we see them. Now, interestingly, importantly enough, he could be taken here as endorsing a philosophical view, something mentioned before, sometimes called idealism, sometimes called phenomenology, sometimes called by Bishop Berkeley immaterialism, but it's the idea that to be is to be perceived. Now, even though Wilde could be endorsing such a view, that to be is to be perceived, it doesn't seem to be what he has in mind. Also, as kind of an aside, if you follow like quantum physics at all, there's a notion that reality is set by observations. But Wilde doesn't seem to mean any of that philosophical stuff. So he's not claiming that to be is to be perceived. What he's claiming is this. When we look at something, that's quite different from seeing. It's just getting the visual impression. Seeing is something more. Again, we can go back to my analogy between looking and seeing compared to listening and hearing. And he claims, perhaps incorrectly, that one does not actually see anything until one sees its beauty. And the way that works, according to Wilde, is this, that we are influenced by the arts. So by looking at, say, of course, in Wilde's time, movies, etc. But you look at paintings, and his claim is that would influence or teach people to see, as opposed to merely looking. And he gives the example of fog. Now, one way to sort of support his view would be something like this. if you ever took a class in art, either like learning to draw or just like a class in art appreciation, one thing you might notice, especially if you're learning how to draw, is that when you go and look at the world, you actually see it somewhat differently. You see the colors differently, layout, etc. Or if you go to a museum and see like paintings of sunsets, when you come out of the museum, you may, instead of just like looking at the sunset, to use Wilde's terminology, you might see it, and see it in terms of being like a painting. So as a quick recap, the challenge is this. Cyril has challenged Vivian to prove that nature imitates art. The way he does this is, he doesn't take like the kind of weird view that painters are out there sort of magically altering the landscape. It's a less extreme view, but fairly plausible one, is that we are shaped in our perceptions by our experience with art, by what we know about it, what we learned about it, perhaps by creating it. And so we go from merely looking at stuff, just having it visually impinge on us, and then truly seeing it. And his claim is we don't truly see anything until we see its beauty. And it is through the arts that we're able to see the beauty of things. Or so he claims. And then, of course, he died. So he regards nature as imitating art. And he gives the example of the sunset, how nature just keeps on imitating these. Now again, he's not, I wanted somebody to ask, is he really serious about that? Does he think like nature is like actually looking at art and, you have this picture of like Mother Nature like putting up sunsets, with looking at, say on her smartphone, pictures of famous, pictures done by famous artists and just creating a sunset that way? And the answer is probably not. So in a way he does answer the question, but it could be seen as a bit of a cheat. Before pressing on, anything about that needs more stuff? Now after addressing that question to Vivian's satisfaction, then turn to another question, one that is, I guess, fairly important in the arts, but also important in the context of various social sciences, culture, identity, and so forth. And here's kind of the thing put forth. The question is, what does art actually express? And depending on which sort of person you talk to, you'll of course get very different answers. Now, Cyril puts forth a fairly standard answer. Cyril claims that art expresses three things. Well, at least three things. First is the temper of its age, the second, the spirit of its time, and thirdly, the moral and social conditions under which it was created. Now, this view put forth by Cyril is a pretty stock view. I recall centuries ago when, just like all students, I had to knock out, what they call today general education requirements. And so I took art history, because I figured it was at that time in my schedule, could fit in right after lunch. And I remember, those long ago days, and the professor went through kind of the standard line. We had the art history book, and we'd start off, way back in history, and then we get to like the Egyptians, and we get the standard, thing about how the Egyptians have these very, strongly built statues and structures designed to withstand, the ravages of time, to provide an immortality, the whole afterlife thing. And of course the idea was it expressed the temper of its time, the spirit of its time, and the moral and social conditions. It expressed the culture. Then of course we went through the Greek stuff, got the similar idea. It expressed the values of Greek culture, and so the art was expressing those things. The age, its times, the moral and social conditions. And then we got to the Roman Empire, and I remember there's a famous work. It's not really good art, but it's in a way probably well known because it shows the Roman Empire had been split up into like three divisions, and they had basically three rulers, and it showed them as like little small people kind of like huddled together. And I remember the professor talking about how the art of Rome had declined as the power of Rome had declined, and so you go from like the copies of the Greek stuff, very strong looking statues done in the classical style, realistic, harmonious, etc. And then you get down to what could be regarded as sort of degenerated art, less quality, kind of, looks actually like more primitive, smaller, more fearful. And of course we're told that it was the declining social conditions of Rome that expressed that. And then of course we apply this to today. When you look at like art from the 1950s, they explain the same way. It expresses the 1950s, the morality of the 50s, etc. And then same with our own time. We explain the art of our time in terms of the same thing. And it's a pretty standard thing. If you ever go to a conference on like cultural studies or read stuff talking about culture and art, they bring this up. They talk about how everything in the art depends on these factors. And it's a well-established kind of standard approach. Now Vivian opposes this. The character Vivian says, rejects all of this, and instead claims that art never expresses anything but itself. Now, that gives rise to an interesting or perhaps boring question. If art is just about itself, why do we think all that other stuff? Why is that kind of standard line? You take an art history class to talk about art and culture, the standard line is, it expresses that time. The 1950s art, take for example, the classic movie, Godzilla, the original one, not the crappy, super crappy remakes. And the original one is presented as expressing, it's post-World War II, Japan, the war had ended due to the bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was a Cold War. At any moment, the world could be vaporized in atomic fire. For real. Actually, it still could happen today. We still have lots of nukes, so we could all die in 12 seconds. Sorry about that. Don't want to bring it down. They take more than 12 seconds. Take about 6 minutes for someone to die. But Godzilla, of course, expressed those fears. He's the coming out of the ocean, and he's radioactive, and he's destroying the city. And so it expressed those social conditions, the fear of the 50s. And similar, like more recent, Japanese anime and manga, etc. And same with American films. Things like Hunger Games or Avengers: Age of Ultron, or like Jurassic World, where they're explained in terms of expressing our current stuff. Now Vivian comes along and says, that's all wrong. It just expresses itself. And of course, he has to answer the question, well then why do people think it's all about the time? And his answer is this. The answer, of course, is given in the classic song, there's an old, ancient song, you can Google it, about, the person says, I think the song is about you, it's because you're so, and the answer is vain, of course. So the person thinks the song is about them because of their vanity. And Vivian thinks the same thing. Well, we think art is all about us because of our vanity. And so naturally, we would extend the same thing to other times. Because if our art is all about us, because we're vain, we can't say like the art of the ancient Egyptians was about us, because we weren't around then. So we say art is about the culture. And so his explanation is basically a psychological one, is vanity. We want it to be about us. But he claims this is not so. Art is not symbolic of the age, nor is it about its time. The ages are the symbols of the art. And it's kind of interesting or boring that people in cultural studies and art really argue a lot about this. So again, one possible viewpoint is the art is about its time. To understand it, you have to look at the time. What were people like? What is the spirit of the time? What moral conditions existed? What social conditions? What kind of economics were there? Relations between people, etc. And Vivian says, no, the art is just about itself. And we think otherwise because we are so very vain. I think it's all got to be about us. Or so it was. And then he died. Now, continuing this, one type of art, of course, is very imitative art. The most obvious example would be, statues and paintings that are about the things they're supposed to be about. I mean, everyone's, seen this kind of stuff. Usually like older paintings or even modern drawings. If you have a sketch of someone, it looks like the person. It's imitative. It's imitating them. Or a statue that looks like a person, imitative. Now, Vivian claims the more imitative art is, if it's statues that look like people or horses or whatever, or drawings that look like people or whatever, then the claim is that represents the spirit of the age much less. So he says, you know, as an example, like the drawings of, you know, brawling drunken peasants done by Dutch artists doesn't tell us anything about the Dutch. And he considers that perhaps the more abstract and ideal a work is, the more it might represent the spirit of its age. So Searle takes it and runs with it. He says, the spirit of the age is revealed, you know, in this manner, and the arts of imitation do reveal the spirit of the age. So Searle's not giving up. He wants to say that the imitative arts tell us about how things look. Now Vivian, of course, disagrees. So kind of the question is, does the imitative arts, what do they tell us about the time? Do they tell us anything about that? Now, so far, the character of, you know, Vivian, who's representing Wilde's view, is that this isn't the case. The art is just about itself. So to illustrate this, he employs an argument by example, you know, using multiple examples. First one he looks at is this, the Middle Ages. You know, basically the medieval art. You know, think of like good examples of this would be, you know, stained glass windows, you know, classic ones from medieval churches. Medieval churches as well, the architecture, you know, the paintings, or you think of like, well, today's the 800th anniversary of the signing of the Magna Carta. So if you've seen on the news, I don't know if they put up pictures of like, you know, of tapestries showing like, you know, medieval battles, etc. That kind of medieval style, you know, which is generally not super realistic. Now, one way to think of it is, well, we call that, you know, art from the Middle Ages or medieval art because it represents the time. It's sort of locked into that time, expressing that time. Wilde says, well, he gives basically one point is this. He claims that, in a way it's kind of an obviously true claim, that the art of the Middle Ages doesn't show us how things really looked then. We don't think, for example, if you look at, you know, stained glass windows from in a medieval church or medieval, you know, artwork like tapestries, we don't think people really looked like that. We assume in general that people look basically the same. Why? Well, kind of the theory behind it is this. He claims that no great artist ever sees things as they really are. So, one claim in a way is kind of the obvious one. Medieval art, people didn't really look like that, because otherwise they'd look pretty weird. And we can assume they look just like us, except, you know, different clothing and less, well, no shower. They didn't have showers back then. Second example he gives is this. Japan, pre-Godzilla. Now, he claims, interestingly or boringly enough, that the Japanese people as presented in art do not exist. No resemblance, and there's nothing extraordinary about them. They're just like the normal run of ordinary humanity. And he claims, oddly or boringly enough, that Japan is a pure invention. Now again, you can be taken as saying something weird, like it's a conspiracy of cartographers, that Japan really doesn't exist, it's just make-believe. But he doesn't mean that, like in the literal sense. He doesn't think like, you know, it's like baked out like the Truman Show or some sort of, you know, weird thing like that. What he means, though, is something perhaps more interesting or maybe more boring. That our sort of conceptions of people and places are fictions. That we sort of, in a way, as he said, they are pure invention. Now he's focusing on the art, so we'll begin by focusing on the art, but we'll see if he can expand. He talks about, as an anecdote, a friend of his who wanted to do Japanese-style painting. And if you've seen, well, probably one of the most famous is the famous one with the wave, and everyone's probably familiar with sort of the classical Japanese style. Very stylized, you know, lots of empty space, that sort of stuff. And he claims, you know, when his friend went to Japan to look for that stuff, Japan didn't look like that artwork, which is hardly surprising. I mean, if you've seen pictures of like actual Japan, the mountains look like any other mountains. I mean, they're mountains, and the people look like any other people. They don't look like the, you know, the drawings. Or if you want to use a more modern example, you can think of like sort of the stylization of anime, you know, really big, big eyes. And people don't have really big eyes that are bigger than their face, type of thing, at least in the normal course of events. And so he talks about his friend who goes there and doesn't see anything. You just sees like some lanterns, some fans, people, normal stuff. And Wilde says that in order to see a Japanese effect, as done in the art, you don't have to go to Japan. What you should do, basically, is sort of get in the psychological mindset. As you know, go look at the paintings, the pictures, etc. And if you can't see a Japanese effect in terms of that style of the art in your backyard, you won't be able to see it anywhere. So in terms of the art, what he's claiming is that these styles, medieval, Japanese, etc., are not capturing, you know, the time, the appearance of things. They're just a particular style of art that could be done presumably at any time. Now, kind of another point that Wilde doesn't really go into, but it's kind of an implication, perhaps an interesting one, is that our conceptions of people, perhaps even ourselves, are pure invention. That we make up these categories by which we see people, and we, in a way, see them through these fictions. Now, Wilde, of course, is talking about art and seeing the, you know, things through beauty, but we also, of course, construct our conceptions of people that define how we categorize them. And one recent example of this, the Twitter sphere and social media was blowing up because the head of the NACP in Spokane turns out to be not a colored person, and that sort of is somewhat relevant to this. Okay, so boring stuff. So we got Japan being a pure invention, and he says essentially it's a creation of, you know, people's ideas, pure inventions. Now his third and final example involves the ancient Greeks, and he notes the example of Greek art. Everyone probably like somewhat vaguely familiar with that. The Greeks are big on these, like, typically these noble, perfect statues, you know, Olympians and gods and heroes and so forth. And we might think just by looking at the art of the Greeks that the people of Greece were really super awesome. They're all doing like a lot of CrossFit or something, whatever the ancient Greek version was. But of course we know from contemporary historical accounts that not the case. That, you know, even though obviously there were people who were pretty fit, pretty much that wasn't the normal sort of deal. So his point is basically that art has never told us the truth, that we create these artistic styles. And so his main conclusion about this is as follows. He, taking the example of medieval times, Japan, and the ancient Greeks, his view is that we construct these styles. People come up with these styles, and they're not fixed to the time. So it's not that medieval art is locked to the medieval time period. It's not that the Japanese art is locked to Japan, not that the work of the ancient Greeks is locked to ancient Greece, that these are but particular styles, and a person could create them at any time. And in fact, to support them, people do. You could have people today do medieval style, they do, you know, stained glass windows, and they draw in the medieval style. People in the United States, you know, can draw in the Japanese style. And of course, someone can create statues and so forth in the style of the ancient Greeks. So his claim is, it's not, in a way, sort of throwing aside the classifications, it's not really medieval art or ancient Greek art, it's just a particular style. He thinks it's a mistake to kind of lock it into the time or place, or so he thinks. And then he died. Now he closes with his doctrines, the four doctrines of the new aesthetics. The first doctrine is this: art never expresses anything but itself. That it's independent of its age. In fact, he claims it often opposes its age and does not reproduce these ages. And he thinks, he claims, perhaps incorrectly, that to pass from the art of a time to the time itself is the great mistake all historians make. And so that ties into what he argued before, that art is not about its time or its culture or its setting. Art is about itself. Now again, this runs contrary and in contrast to a very common view, and as he himself says, in regards to history, especially art history, that the art is results out of the culture. So if he's right, art is just about itself. And so going and trying to like interpret or impose the culture upon it would be a mistake, if he's right. But just because he's Oscar Wilde and really did, doesn't guarantee that he is right. Second doctrine. All bad art comes from returning to life and nature and elevating them into ideals. And he claims, interestingly, boringly enough, that realism is a complete failure, or so he claims. Now, not surprising, there are people who disagree with him, namely people who like realism. And he claims that we should avoid, the modern. Why? Well, one reason is this. Only the modern goes out of fashion or style, goes out of date, because it's, modern. He also claims, secondly, that the only beautiful things are things that do not concern us, or so he claims. So, in making this argument, he claims those two main points. Now, of course, again, just because he's Oscar Wilde doesn't mean that he's right. One way to consider his view may be something like this. We could think, to use a concrete example, well, two sort of illustrations. One could be in the context of music. One thing that happened, well, maybe it's not been done all through history, but fairly recently, was if you go back to the 1960s, they hit on this idea, hey, let's have a show about a band. And they came up with this idea of having a show called The Monkees, an ancient TV show. And what they did is basically just, some of the people on the show couldn't even play instruments, so they just sort of created a band, created the show. It was very successful. Then we jump ahead to like the 1990s, we see things like the famous creation of the various boy bands, like Justin Timberwolf's band and various other ones. Like New Kids on the Block, In Sync, Out of Sync, Kitchen Sink, and those various boy band groups. And they were literally manufactured. They were created, marketing sat down and said, hey, this is what our demographic wants. We'll create a band, put it out there, make money. But as everyone finds out, that if you go back and try to revisit, the boy bands, the 90s, what was once like really cool and popular, not so much now. They're kind of, since they're linked to that time, they are kind of stuck there. Another example would be movies. Now, some movies, one might say, can be kind of sort of timeless. There are others, though, that are pretty clearly locked in, like comedies. And what they often, what Hollywood often does, perhaps justifiably, perhaps not, is kind of remake them. For example, one movie, the classic one, I think it's called Freaky Friday. The mother and daughter, change, minds. And that's been remade, I don't know, like 10,000 times. And the reason is, of course, if you see a movie, because it relies so heavily on what it is to be a teenager and an adult during that time period, if you saw the original one, you probably get some of the humor, but a lot of it is very connected to that time. And of course, when they remake it, they connect it to that time, and hopefully it makes more sense. And when they made it again, same sort of deal. And so you might say that he's right. If you have something that's strongly linked to a particular time, especially like comedy or music, then it eventually fails quickly. And so he claims bad art comes from returning to life and nature and basically trying to imitate bad time. Or so he claims. And then he died. Final two. Third doctrine is the thing he started out with. The challenge was, the character said, to try to show that it is not art imitating life, but life imitating art. And the third doctrine, he claims, life imitates art far more than art imitates life. The fourth doctrine, perhaps the most interesting of the four, is this, that lying, the telling of beautiful, untrue things, is the proper aim of art. The good question, of course, would be, is that true? Now, Wilde, of course, was not the first person to claim this. If we go back to our good dead friend Aristotle, Aristotle made a similar claim. that basically art involves presenting things that are untrue. And of course, it does give rise to an interesting question, namely, like, is that right? And of course, there's also the interesting question of what's the difference between, say, a lie and a beautiful lie. Now, looked at, pretty directly, it seems that both our good dead friend Aristotle and our good dead friend Wilde are both right, and we can easily prove this. For example, we can take works of fiction. By definition, they are untrue things because they're fiction. So if we talk about Romeo and Juliet, if we talk about Jurassic World, we talk about Thor, if we talk about Darth Vader, we're talking about untrue things. There is none of that stuff. It's all untrue. And similarly, even in music, you can have songs that are not about, they're about maybe general stuff, but not about a particular person. They can be just made up. And so pretty clearly, our works of fiction are clearly untrue, be it a novel, a poem, a movie, TV show, etc. So that part seems correct. Then there's kind of an interesting distinction between lying and beautiful lying. Because in general, we think of lying as being bad. At the very least, we don't want people lying to us about stuff. And so what would be the difference between, say, aesthetic lying and just lying? And I think Wilde kind of lays out an interesting distinction. Namely, when one is doing aesthetics, one is telling beautiful, untrue things. So we wouldn't accuse the author of, a great work. We don't accuse Shakespeare of being a liar. Well, he might have been a liar, probably was a liar, because everyone lies. But we wouldn't say, Shakespeare is a liar, all these plays, all those lies. We know that it's a fiction, but we consider a different sort of untruth, because perhaps the distinction is telling a lie that is beautiful, yet untrue, as opposed to lying for the purpose of malice or to gain, for deception. And so in closing, for the new aesthetics, perhaps the most interesting and important of the doctrines is the fourth doctrine, that lying, the telling of beautiful, untrue things, is the proper aim of art. So if we're going to tell lies, at least we should tell beautiful lies. So that brings us to the end of aesthetics. Again, if you can't get enough aesthetics, there's a lot of aesthetic stuff, books, movies, etc. But also, of course, there's PHI 4800, section 001, offered every spring, 2 o'clock to 3:15. Okay, if there are no questions or comments or anything, we'll head to a final part of the final part, namely political philosophy. Now, not surprisingly, a big chunk of philosophy, and to be honest about it, perhaps one of the most important parts of philosophy is social and political philosophy. And not surprisingly, this is the philosophy of, well, all the social and political sciences. So philosophy of like sociology, philosophy of politics, philosophy of law, philosophy of anthropology, all the stuff would fall under here. And it deals with, well, in the case of social philosophy, it deals with the philosophic study and examination of social systems, all the social stuff. In the case of political philosophy, it deals with the philosophical study of coercive institutions. And also the various subtypes are philosophy of law, etc. Now there are all sorts of classic problems and questions in social philosophy. We'll look at a couple of these, but there are a multitude. For example, one of the foundational ones is the question of the basis of political authority. And again, conveniently enough, today is the 800th anniversary of the signing of the Magna Carta, which deals with issues about like rights and political authority. One of the oldest foundations of political authority was this. Why did you get to rule? Well, because you are God. And for example, the ancient Egyptian pharaohs cast themselves as gods. Some people were more modest. They did not claim to be gods themselves. They merely claimed to be the children of the gods. For example, Alexander the Great made such a claim. And of course that's, I guess a way to really get some credentials. If you're a god, I guess pretty good credentials, looks good on the resume. Or if one is not a god oneself, then being the son or daughter of a god, probably pretty good too. But then of course what happened is you eventually get into the rise of Christianity and Islam, etc. And of course a Christian king cannot claim to be God. And he cannot claim to be the son of God, because that would be like, blasphemy, etc. So they went to the next best thing. So if you can't be God or the child of a god, you could rule by divine right. If you know anything about European history, for quite a while the king would claim to rule by divine right. They're king because God wants him to be king. Now of course eventually, thanks to things like the Magna Carta, that eventually kind of gave way. So for example now, England has a queen, they got princes and princesses and stuff, but we probably don't believe that God appointed them to rule the country, even though they're doing pretty well, doing very little for lots of money, kind of like being our celebrities. And so today we don't typically accept the divine right of kings. We instead accept the notion of democracy, the idea of government, from the people, by the people, for the people, that type of deal. And so one of the classic questions is, what is the basis of authority? Why do people in charge have a right to tell us how fast we can drive, who we can marry, what we can eat, where we can go, what we can say, what we can think? What gives them the right? Other classic problems and questions include such things as, the questions of rights. In the United States, of course, we claim to have the right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. There's also the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which claims all sorts of rights for people. And a good question is, what is the foundation for those rights? In the Declaration of Independence, which is clearly founded on views held by people like John Locke, it goes back to God. The Declaration says, endowed by the Creator with unalienable rights, and so it's kind of in a way back to instead of being the divine right of kings, it's kind of the divine rights of people. Other classic problems include things like liberty, which we'll be looking at, and how much of our business is the business of the state and other people. So there are all sorts of classic questions and problems in political and social philosophy. Now to focus it, I've selected sort of a classic problem to give it a look at the general field of political and social philosophy. And in the West, we consider this one of our most important things, namely liberty, or as we sometimes put it, freedom. And there are all kinds of questions about it, like what is liberty? What is freedom? Who decides how free we should be? What freedoms should we have? Now in generic terms, liberty of course is, we also use the term freedom. And we're free to the degree that we can do stuff without having to ask permission. That we can just do as we will without having to worry about getting into trouble or having to ask someone else if we can do this, to have more pudding, for example. Now I don't want to say boringly enough, one thinker came up with a kind of interesting idea, the notion of positive liberty and negative liberty. By this he didn't mean like good liberty and bad liberty, like positive is like liberty to do nice things, like adopt a kitten, or give candy to children, or help someone across the street. And he didn't mean by negative liberty being able to do evil things, like throw kittens in wood chippers, or push old people in front of cars, or horrible stuff like that. He means something quite different. A negative liberty, put kind of informally, is you have the freedom. So people generally, under normal conditions, aren't allowed to stop you or interfere with you. But you're not given the means to exercise that liberty. It's like, you're free to do this, we're not going to stop you, but we're not going to help you. For example, in the United States, we have a negative liberty of travel. Suppose you want to go to California tomorrow. You can go. You can just say, I'm going to California, and start heading towards California. Because we have that negative liberty in the sense that they're not going to stop you, in general, but you're not going to have the means to do so. You can't go down like the government office of freedom and say, I'd like my ticket to California. So we're not provided with the means of doing this. You're not if you want to go to California, you're not guaranteed a plane ticket or a bus ticket or even skateboard. But you're allowed to do that. You have a negative liberty, you're free to do it, but no one's obligated to assist you. Now, positive liberty is, in some ways, an even better freedom, because you're free to do it. That is to say, people under normal circumstances are not supposed to stop you, but you're also given the means to exercise that liberty. One example, which may not seem like a freedom, is education. It may seem more like a punishment or imposition, but you know, K through 12 education in the US is a liberty. We're free to do that. In the past, and in some parts of the world, people are forbidden from being, from being educated, from going to school. But it's a positive liberty because, at least in the United States, K through 12 is provided. You don't, like when you go to the public school, you have to go in, and pay admission. I mean, yeah, someone's got to pay taxes for it, etc., but there's no specific charge to you for K through 12. So it is a positive liberty. People are no longer allowed to keep you from, getting education, and you're provided with the means of exercising that freedom. So negative liberty is you're free to do it, but no one owes you the means to do so, like freedom to travel. Similarly, we can look at education, 13 plus through grad school. You have a negative liberty in the sense that you can't be denied, the freedom to go on to school just, arbitrarily, but of course you're not necessarily given the means to do so. Now, one or two interesting or boring questions are, who or what should determine how free we should be? In other words, when we're deciding the freedom in our society, who should be doing the deciding? And there are various answers. On one extreme, we have the idea the state should decide everything. On another extreme, called anarchism, there's the view that the individual should decide. There should in fact be no state whatsoever. Now when it comes to liberty, one of the sort of classic competitions or context, especially relevant since 9/11, is liberty versus security. And here's the idea. There's the view, the theory, that we can trade freedoms to become more secure. So it's generally presented as kind of trade-off. The more liberty you have, that is, the less safe will be. And sort of the corollary would be, if we reduce liberty, we'll increase security. And it's always been a concern, throughout human history, but again, after 9/11, of course, it became quite the big deal. And we had the Patriot Act, go through, and various other laws, NSA spying, etc. And then the Patriot Act was set to expire this year, and we've heard about the revelations from Snowden about NSA spying, getting in our business, etc. And so we kind of revisited those a little bit. Then went back to doing pretty much what we were doing all along. But the usual argument goes is, we have to give up our liberty to be safer. Now, of course, this gives rise to some important questions. Suppose someone is proposing a new imposition on liberty, or we can take an existing one. For example, if you're familiar at all with the NSA and their bulk data collection, every phone call you made, the phone calls itself wasn't recorded, but it was tracked. So every number you called has been stored. You calling their number, stored. They also found out that apparently, I mentioned before, if you happen to use Yahoo video chat, and they recorded that. I mean, not everything, but every few frames they were recorded, and they have that all stored someplace. And so the argument is, of course, by lowering our liberty, our privacy, we become safer. That's the claim. So one question is a very practical question. Whenever something is proposed that aims at restricting our liberty, and privacy is liberty, does it actually deliver security? For example, when they were debating, whether to continue the NSA surveillance program, people were saying, like, well, if we don't have this, we're all going to die, basically. But an obvious question would be, has it actually done anything? And looking at the information, apparently, we had that bulk data collection going for years, Patriot Act going for years, and as far as the evidence shows, it led to nothing. It had no positive effect. And so the first question is a very practical one. Does that imposition, does it actually have any positive effect? Does it actually make us safer? Another example, I mean, if you've flown in recent years, you know the drill. You go, you take your belt off, you take your shoes off, you dump out all your water, you put your stuff through the X-ray, you go and stand in the scanner, do all that stuff. And of course they're getting into your stuff, they're taking pictures of you, touching you, etc. And the question is, does it actually make us safer? So question one is a very practical one. Whatever is proposed, does it in fact make us safer? Now the second question is the question of, suppose it does make us safer. Is it worth that trade-off? Because giving up our liberties, that's a price we're paying. We are less free. Now one sort of bumper sticker kind of unthinking claim is your freedoms don't matter if you're in a coffin, which is true, but in a way it's kind of unthinking, because then the idea would be to give up your freedom to anything that may possibly harm you. So give out all of that. But then a more reasoned approach is to say, well, how much safer does this make us, and is it worth the price? I mean, for example, if we want to be super safe, one thing we could do is it could all be microchipped, so it can be tracked all the time. There could be cameras everywhere, watching us all the time, 24 hours a day. And it wouldn't make us perfectly safe, because some people would still do awful stuff, but we'd be much safer, because we'd know where everyone was, and we'd be seeing everything all the time, which would probably lower crime quite a bit. But it'd be a fair question to ask is that worth the price? So question one is, does the alleged security proposal, does it make us safer? Does it make us better off? And then secondly, if it does, is it worth the price? What do we give up to be safer? And they say freedom isn't free, which is true, but also security isn't free. It is a cost of freedom. So the number one reason to limit liberty is typically security. Now, of course, there are some good reasons to put limits. For example, it's probably a good idea that people aren't able to own personal nuclear weapons, because that would probably be bad. Similarly, it's probably a good idea that people aren't allowed to own personal rocket launchers, because that would probably be bad. Similarly, it's probably good that people aren't allowed to have biochemical weapons, just own them, because that would probably be bad. And so we do give up quite a few liberties for security. For example, we give the freedom to kill each other in order to be safer. So we have those rules and injunctions against murder. That's probably okay. Similarly against theft. We give up the liberty to steal from people to make us safer. So some things do seem to make us safer, and perhaps seem to be worth the price. So reason one, security. Now, of course, there are other grounds for limiting liberty. For example, one common one is to avoid other harms, not dealing with security directly, but avoid things that are harmful. For example, if you're familiar with New York City, the previous mayor, Mayor Bloomberg, was famous for a lot of things. One thing he was famous for, of course, was putting a ban on really big drinks. It created a bit of a controversy, because if you went into particular stores, you couldn't buy big soda. You could buy as many little sodas as you want, but you couldn't buy the big soda. And his reasoning was that our liberty to buy big soda had to be restricted because of the potential harms, obesity, diabetes, etc. Similarly, the laws against things like marijuana, cocaine, heroin, painkillers, etc., they're not security concerns. The terrorists don't win if people are smoking marijuana, but they're put on the grounds of harm. That marijuana and so forth and drugs are harmful to people. So another ground for limiting liberty is essentially kind of various on security, but focused on preventing harm. Now there are some things, of course, that don't seem to create harm. use a concrete example, something like same-sex marriage. I mean, people have argued that if we allow same-sex marriage, it will have all these harmful effects, but it seems to be largely unsupported. It's not clear like why that would cause like damage, like how it would allow the terrorists to win, or how it would cause like various harms. But to be fair, there are people who do make that argument. But if we look at the best available information, it seems that it doesn't. So we couldn't argue that we need to ban this based on harm or security. So a third reason people often give for limiting liberty is just purely, say, moral. That even if it's not harmful, or even if it's not a threat to security, it's just wrong. We just shouldn't do it. Now the challenge there, of course, is cashing out what makes it wrong. So it's not hurting anyone, it's not putting anyone in danger, what makes it bad? Now before pressing into a first reading in this regard, anything about liberty that needs more stuff? Okay, so quick recap for like quiz test stuff. Liberty, basically freedom. Positive, negative liberty difference is this. Positive is that you have the freedom to do so, and you're provided, roughly put, with a means of doing so. Example would be K through 12 education in the US. You are not denied education, you're free to be educated, you have liberty, but you're also given the means. You're provided with K through 12 education. A negative liberty is one where you have the freedom. People under normal conditions are not supposed to stop you, but they don't give you the means. Example would be the freedom to travel. Second example would be freedom of expression. We have freedom of expression, but people don't give us, you don't get like free airtime on TV or your own free website to express your ideas. So the idea is you're not given the means, but people aren't supposed to stop you. Okay, our first reading is from Benito Mussolini. A little background from Mussolini. He, best known for being the dictator of Italy prior to World War II, famously made the trains run on time, partnered up with a guy named Adolf Hitler in Germany, and then plunged the world into World War II, fighting with the Germany, Italy, and Japan, squared off against the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, the United States, and other allies, in a battle that lasted quite a while. Mussolini came to about it. When the Allies invaded Italy, he was overthrown, deposed as the dictator, and eventually was killed by his own people and hung from a lamppost. So, pretty bad end. But before he died, quite a bit before he died, he wrote an essay on fascism. Now, fascism is interesting and important view. Now, the importance comes in a variety of ways. One is, of course, sort of like conceptually. Fascism is one of the big political systems, so in understanding how political systems work, it's good to know a little bit about things like fascism, democracy, socialism, anarchism, etc. Secondly, there's also the historical thing. World War II, in many ways, is a battle between the forces of fascism up against democracy and communism. Although the fascist states, Germany, Japan, and Italy were defeated, and now they're nominally democracies, it still has relevance today. How so? Well, it's still a political view, and of course, the term still gets thrown out. First example, back during the Bush administration, there were several New York Times best-selling books claiming that the neoconservatives were moving us towards fascism. The neoconservatives I haven't heard in a while, they used the phrase Islamofascism. And then of course, when President Obama became president, the conservatives accused him of being a fascist. And so we still use the word. And like with any words, if you want to know if something is like true or not, you kind of got to know what it means. So when they accuse the Bush administration of heading towards fascism, when people talk about Islamofascism, and when Obama's accused of being a fascist, we kind of got to know what that means. Are they just saying like, throwing the label on them, saying they're bad, we don't like them, is a bad word, or is it for real? And the way to tell if it's for real is to know what fascism is. So what does fascism straight from the fascist mouth. Well, here are some of its defining qualities. First, peace. The fascists claim, firstly, that peace, perpetual peace, is impossible. So, claim 1, peace is impossible. Now, claim 2 regarding peace is this. Even if peace were possible, it would be undesirable. Which may seem kind of a pointless thing. It'd be kind of like saying that, you know, it's impossible to make like a hoverboard, but they'd be undesirable if we could. It would seem kind of pointless. Something's not possible, really doesn't matter to talk more about it. But I guess they're being thorough. So claim 1, peace is impossible. Claim 2, that peace, if it were possible, would be bad. Now, this, not surprisingly, leads to the view that war is good. And a good question would be is, so what makes war good? Well, one thing would be, of course, maybe not make it good, but if peace is impossible, that would seem to imply that war is kind of always going to be here, because war is kind of the opposite of peace. But there's still a separate question of why it would be regarded as good. And the fascists give basically 2 answers. Answer 1. The claim is that only war basically brings out the opportunity for people being at their very best. And even today, we hear people talking about that. You know, the war brings out the very best, and sometimes the worst, in people. It's a chance to be, very heroic, etc. Reason 2 is this: the fascists claim that war basically brings people's energy to the highest level and results in the greatest productivity. Now, interestingly or boringly enough, there is some evidence supporting the fascist claim. Not that war is good, but that it has these effects. For example, in wartime, at least like this, sort of conventional wars like World War II, etc., the people's energy is focused. Or we can go back to like right after 9/11. The country is much more unified. People were kinder, more polite, more caring, at least immediately afterwards. And of course, if we look at World War II as an example, it does really bring up the energy, because if you're fighting to survive, nothing motivates like avoiding death. So, peace bad and impossible. War good, because it provides the opportunity for greatness and brings everything up to the highest level. And of course, progress. In every war they make progress because they find a new way to kill you. Now, given their dislike of peace and their love of war, it might be suspected that the fascists are opposed to life. Interestingly, or boringly enough, Mussolini claims this is not the case. He claims the fascists love life and oppose suicide. Now, this is potentially true, potentially false. How so? Well, what we have to do is kind of look historically at, what played out during World War II. Now, going back to the point about loving life, what he claims is this. When he says the fascists love life, he's not picturing kind of like a granola-style scenario. Someone like getting up in the morning, standing on a beautiful mountaintop saying, love life. What he means basically is this. He claims that they love life, but your life, as a fascist sees it, is not your own. Your life belongs to the state. And so not surprisingly, the state doesn't want you to be dead because you're more useful alive. Now, getting to the point about, loving life and despising suicide, what we can do is look at the historical examples. We can take Germany, Italy, Japan. Now, in support of Mussolini, interestingly enough, or boringly enough, in large, the Germans and Italians did not engage in suicide tactics, even when they were losing the war. In general, they kept fighting. For example, the Germans kept fighting until Berlin was in ruins and taken over by ground forces. But in general, they didn't take suicide tactics, typically. They kept fighting, but not suicide tactics. In contrast, however, if you look at Japan, Japan is famous in World War II for the kamikaze, the divine wind. And they take a plane loaded with explosives, pilot would get in, take off, head out to sea, looking for the biggest American ship he could spot, and then try to crash into it. And they were very effective weapons. They were essentially guided missiles of the time, because what was guiding it was a person flying the plane. And it was, literally a suicide tactic. The person knew they weren't going in trying to drop a bomb, hoping and trying to not get killed. They were going to die. But it was effective, because if you crash a plane into a ship, pilot's dead, but you may take out a ship or badly damage it, kill lots of Americans, destroy the carrier, wipe out a lot of planes, take out a destroyer, that kind of stuff. They also, interesting, boring enough, had suicide submarines. Same type of deal. Little sub, basically a torpedo steered by a person. So Mussolini is kind of right, kind of not. The Germans and Germans and Italians, by and large, didn't do that. In fact, there was a movement in Germany. There was a famous pilot, a woman who wanted to do this stuff, but it wasn't apparently very appealing to the Germans. They were fine to fighting to the end, but the idea of like crashing this stuff, deliberate suicide, didn't appeal to them. So Mussolini kind of right, kind of not. So, peace impossible and bad. War, good and unavoidable. Life, good, but not in the sort of like happy Walt Disney style thing, more like life is good because you need to exist to serve the state. What we'll close with today is looking at fascism contrasted with Marxism. Now, during World War II, of course, we had the democracies, the United States, UK, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, up against the fascist states. But I also had as an ally the Soviet Union, the USSR, which is gone now, but chunks of it live on as Russia. Now, the Soviets nominally adopted what's called Marxism. China still claims today to be kind of Marxist, as does our neighbors to the south, Cuba. Still claims to be like a socialist, Marxist state. And so there's still a little bit of Marxism kind of around. Not as big as it used to be, but still there. So, just like with fascism, it's a good idea to know a bit of like, what is Marxism? But here's Marxism rolled down to a few minutes. Now, one of the key things about Marxism is to look at its metaphysics. It is a materialistic view. Namely, if you were asked a true Marxist, is the world material or is there non-material stuff like God and souls and stuff? And Marxism is materialistic. In fact, it's famously an atheistic view, the denial of God. So, sort of the first thing metaphysically is materialistic. Now, another thing that's sort of crucial to Marxism is, in terms of explaining everything, which is also metaphysics, is what's called economic determinism. So the view is basically the economic forces, the means, the modes of production, are what make things happen. So if you're explaining society and history, it's explained in terms of economic factors, which is also similar in some ways to how capitalism works. So materialistic, so no God, and everything is economic determinism, so no free will. History plays out based on economic forces. Also critical, and the main thing the fascists kind of go after is this. The Marxists have this notion that under capitalism, that's our system, that you'll have two classes of people. You'll have the bourgeois, who are the property owners, and there'll be few of those. They'll be at the top of the pyramid. And then you'll have what are called the proletariat, or proles, and they're the workers that do all the work. Basically, the haves and the have-nots, the owners and the workers. And what Marx claimed would happen would be this. You would have, sort of initially, a fair number of bourgeois, the petty bourgeois, the greater bourgeois, and then you'd have, proletariat doing the work. But what would happen is, you would have ever greater concentrations of wealth, or so Marx claimed. And eventually what he said would happen is, you'd end up with basically hyper-concentration. you'd have very few owners, very few true capitalists, the bourgeois owners, and virtually everyone else would be a proletariat, a worker, a have-not. And what he claimed would happen would be this. The proletariat would say, hey, there's a whole bunch more of us than those guys. Not a lot of them. And they get all the stuff, and they're being jerks. And so what they would do, according to Marx, is they'd see, hey, there's not many of those people, and they would wipe them out. Some of the bourgeois would go over to the side of the proletariat, but for the most part, that'd be it for the bourgeois. So the question would be, after this class warfare between the proletariat and the bourgeois, in which, according to Marx, the bourgeois lose, what's the next step? Well, according to Marx, we'd end up in what he called socialism. Now, of course, people throw around the word socialism today to a degree that makes it almost meaningless. By socialism, they usually mean like bad. And then, of course, we do have a socialist in the race, Bernie Sanders, a guy from up in my part of the world, New England. He's actually an avowed socialist, like one of the few in the United States. Now, Obama, of course, gets accused of being a socialist all the time as well. But basically, calling someone a socialist is like swearing at them. But what does it really mean? Well, here's what it is to be a socialist, like in the classic sense. A socialist believes that the economy should be owned and controlled by the state. Does that mean that the state owns like your toothbrush and your socks and your underwear? Well, no. It's not the extermination of like, you're owning your individual stuff, but the idea is that the economy, the companies, etc., are owned by the state. So pure socialism would be something like there was, well, not really pure, but it'd be in theory what they have in like China or Cuba. The idea would be the state would own everything. There wouldn't be private companies. Now, in practice, of course, you end up the same type of thing. You have people who are super rich and super poor, same sort of deal. But in theory, under socialism, the state owns all the means and modes of production. It owns industry and the economy. At least that's the theory. Now, Marx said what happened is this. As technology kept advancing, productivity would increase to the degree that we'd have so much stuff that we wouldn't need to have a state anymore. Why? Well, as Marx saw it, the function of the state was to keep people in line, basically to keep the proletariat in line, to protect the bourgeois. And if we all have all the stuff we need, there's no need to like oppress people. You don't need the police like beating people down to keep them from threatening the bourgeois. You don't have to like force people to go to terrible factories to work, because the view was the technology make it such that there's so much productivity we can have as much as we need. You don't have to like crush people anymore, or so we claimed. And what he claimed to close would happen is this: eventually we would need the state to oppress people. So socialism would turn to what he called communism. And under communism, there wouldn't be any more proletariat or bourgeois. It'd just be people. You'd have no state, because on his view, the state exists to exert control through coercion. You would need that. To use an example thing, if you ever watched like Star Trek, the Star Trek future where if you need something, you just go to a replicator. And you just tell the replicator you want like clothing or tea or whatever, you just get it. The idea is you have a society that is so wealthy, you don't need a state to crush and oppress people anymore. So it'd be a state of, as Marx said, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. Or so we claimed. Now again, in the United States, we consider socialism and communism to be the greatest of evils, because we're capitalist. But anyway, so if you, in basically 5 minutes, that's, a lot of stuff. So that's Marxism. Why does the fascist hate it? Well, next time we'll see why the fascist hates the Marxist. So have a good rest of the day. If you haven't done the paper yet and want to do it and get like full credit,